Okay, I want to do a video and talk about knowing when to hold them, knowing when to fold them. There are many things in this life that we have relationships with. Some of these things are people. That's a little bit crude way to put it. People are not things as such, but we have relationships with many different aspects of our life, with people, with our finances, with jobs, with things that are things like cars and the objects, physical objects in our life, and all kinds of relationships to self, etc. And there is an underlying principle here. It's something like how many cliches can we cram in here? To every, what is the lyric? To everything there is a season. I need to look that up. Who is that? The Birds, Mamas and the Papas? No, I'm pretty sure it's based on Ecclesiastes, right, in the Bible. Anyways, I want to explore this question around when something is supportive, a relationship with in whatever domain is supportive and something to be held on to in a sense, or to be allowed into one's life, and when it is not supportive, and some related questions in between on all of that. And let's just say, just for an example's sake, a relationship with a significant other. It's a blessing if you have that. It's a vocation, the way I look at it now. Maybe that seems a little bit off-putting to put it that way, but it's a calling in a sense, to be in relationship that way. And some are called into it, and shock of shocks, some people are not called to be in relationship. Let's say in a romantic relationship with somebody, let's say married, or having a significant other, dating even, boyfriend, girlfriend type of thing. But why are some called into those relationships? Well, looked at from the highest, looked at from the vantage point of what's holy, what's right, what's true, looked at the vantage point from God's eye perspective. Blasphemous thing to say, not that it can, but let's just say looking at it from a more holy vantage point. We have these dances to dance with each other, in a sense, sometimes for a lifetime, sometimes not. And they're there for our perfection. Not that we reach perfection, but that we move in that direction. They are there for our growth. It's maybe a less intimidating way to say it. So somebody comes into our life, and there is a resonance there. There's a connection there. There's a relationship. There's trust there. That's a whole nother video maybe I would do at some point. I think those are synonyms, trust and relationship. And if not synonyms, they just are so closely linked that it's almost hard to tease the two apart, but they might be just synonyms. But anybody that has been in any kind of relationship, and I'm not even sure why I'm trying to make it so specific to a romantic relationship. It could be totally platonic friendships, but just some kind of a human relationship with somebody. there is no perfect relationship. I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. And if you stick with it and you're in a relationship in an authentic way, eventually, because we are imperfect, we've got rough edges, eventually there's going to be, you might, perhaps, maybe not, maybe you're the exception, right? But you may, in due time, come to find out that there's some conflict there, friction. You bump up against some type of adversity within the relationship. And that is part of the package. I'm going to say, unfortunately. I know it's not the spiritually wise thing to say, but conflict is not something to look forward to. I certainly don't. Are there fruits that come from it? Sure, but I'll take peace any day of the week, brother. I'll take peace 10 times out of 10. Let's not like fetishize or pedestalize conflict. I would way rather a day without conflict than a day including conflict. Let me just bracket the whole conversation by saying that, or preface the whole conversation by saying that, but likely you'll come up against, even in the best relationship, most compatible, harmonious relationship, you'll likely come across some friction, some disagreement. So we wish it wasn't so on one level. And yet we're here in this broken world, this partial world, incomplete world. And that's part of the service, you could say, or the function of relationship. In a sense, again, I don't want to overly romanticize or pedestalize this because conflict is for the birds, but you could say in a sense there is a function there, just like in a rock tumbler. The rocks bumping into each other, they sand off the rough edges and they become smooth over time. It's something analogous to that, where God puts us in relationships with certain people almost by design. Again, I hate this kind of language, so hold this lightly, but almost well, even if we don't attribute intention to it, but it has the effect of often of pointing out to us these other people we're in relationship. These relationships have the effect of pointing out to us stuck places, unhealed places, undeveloped places, wounded places. Triggers is one word for it, kind of overused word, but and if you develop in that direction of embracing, that doesn't feel quite right, but of working through these conflicts, you can grow. It can be for your growth, right? I don't think anything I'm saying here is novel. It's pretty standard, straightforward stuff, but and it can help the relationship, that you get through a tough period and you've got that resilience built in now. You've got that shared commitment. You've got that shared healing. You've got that renewed strength within the trust. So it's like the capacity for dealing with difficulty grows, and there's a greater affinity, a greater trust, a greater strength in the relationship. Ideally, that's one of the gifts that can come out of a relationship. That we push each other's buttons, that kind of a thing. And so that's good. It's like healthy, constructive conflict, healthy, constructive disagreement that pushes, that's at one another's growth edge, and you grow together and you heal together. Or heal individually, but within the context of a relationship. Now there's a spectrum here and a gradient here, and I'm trying to figure out the best way to enter into expressing this. it's almost like there's a bandwidth of, or a range of healthy conflict, healthy disagreement, healthy, um, let me say it this way, because if it's total disagreement 24/7, if it, just to put it in the extreme, if it's total conflict 24/7, that's obviously not helping anybody, right? So we can see that at one extreme, perfection, the perfect zero conflict relationship at the other extreme, which doesn't exist. And so those are kind of the parameters here. And then there's this whole spectrum in between. And there's a point at which there's such chaos, such friction, such disagreement, such work that needs to be done, that it enters into an unhealthy, it's like there's a threshold that's crossed there, and it enters into that unhealthy end of the spectrum. So that's a useful metaphor and useful thing to recognize with a relationship, that there's like a range of healthy, because you can have this feeling when you really connect with somebody that you want it to just, why can't we always just be this harmonious, you know? This side of heaven, it just doesn't seem to really be that way. But there are levels here, right? And there are healthier, more harmonious relationships and less harmonious relationships. So, but there is in each, and I think these are individual, it's like an individual discernment process, and it's going to be individual to our growth edge, how much capacity we have, the true alignment and fit of a relationship with somebody. You could be very highly developed, very healed, very balanced, but have the wrong person in your life, and no amount of healthy, constructive movement, healthy, constructive engagement is going to bring harmony. That's a possibility there too. So, but that pivot point, that threshold, is a very important thing to explore. And exploring it with questions like, at what point is this too toxic? At what point is this too unhealthy? At what point is this no longer worth it? And those are sort of the questions that can come to mind. And in this culture, we're up against a number of different forces from a number of different angles. So I want to, again, open this up to just kind of a broader conversation. I want to bring in some different ways to look at this, because on the one hand, we live in a culture of obsolescence, a culture of discard, a culture of trying to think of another word here, of low commitment, of instant gratification. I'm thinking of food for some reasons, like, and I'll try to bring maybe this metaphor in, fast food versus a real meal. It's like we want everything to work out instantly. We don't want to make a big commitment. We just want pleasure, 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 gratification, gratification, gratification. And so that's one of the forces that I think predisposes us culturally, all of us, many of us, to too quickly cut ties, to too quickly run, to too quickly, when the waters get a little bit choppy, to jump ship, or to abandon ship, to to be concrete, to break up if it's a romantic relationship or a friendship. And this is a very novel thing, a novel time that we're in, and technology has really been the driving force behind this kind of a change, where, something like dating apps, you just have this overwhelming, it brings into frame and it brings into one's consciousness this feeling of there we go, disposability culture. That's what I was thinking of. That's a good word for what I'm thinking of. That people become disposable in a sense because you've got so many options in a way that prior to something like dating apps, prior to the internet, prior to, these advances in technology, if we're looking at dating, your dating pool was much more restricted to the people in your immediate environment. I mean, it depends on how far back we rewind the reels, but even 50 years ago, you ended up dating and marrying usually the people who you went to school with, right? The people who were within a not too extended radius of where you lived, essentially. And I think that still holds true in many ways. But it's almost like our consciousness has been invaded with this idea of disposability, which has a number of consequences that kind of stem from that. One is this sense of, how do I know when to settle? Because there could always be, it's sort of the Amazon paradox for me. It's like, I'm trying to buy something stupid like boxers or a trash can for my car, and there's 500 different choices, and it's like I've had to develop some ways of, the filters help, but I've also had to internally develop some ways of more efficiently narrowing in on just a few. And even there I get caught up, and it has to do with my own perfectionism and OCD and stuff, but it's fueled by this overwhelming sense of choice, where it's like you can get really paralyzed and you can have this sense of, I don't know if I should settle on this trash can or on this person, because there could be a better one that's just a little bit closer to that internal harmony, internal alignment that I'm looking for. And it's easier to make the decision now up front and do my due diligence now up front than downstream to be involved with something, with a purchase or with a relationship or whatever, and then try to extract myself or try to reconfigure. And so you can get really kind of overwhelmed in that direction too, because of choice and actual choice, and also this kind of internalized sense of choice. So what is that? The paradox. Something like the paradox of choice. I think I first heard about it in relationship to grocery stores, standing in front of ketchups, and there's 20 different ketchups, or salad dressings, and there's 30, 40 different options, and you just kind of can get paralyzed. Do I make this purchase? But then I might be, the moment you decide, you're closing off that infinite avenue of possibility. There's something nice about being in the realm still of possibility, and something scary about concrete action, in a sense. I'm sure I could explain all this better, but hopefully I've given a sense of it. So we have this culture, this overwhelming sense of choice and possibility that can be really paralyzing, and feeling like, I don't know if I should settle. And so you just don't ever settle. I mean, in the extreme. But then there's also this sense of disposability that plays that's tied in here, that plays a role, where we're much quicker nowadays to break off commitments, and to not, when things do get a little bit difficult, just to think, well, I don't want to deal with this stress. There's probably something better out there. It's not worth it, Again, it's a number of interconnected things, but part of it is that instant gratification. Hedonic treadmill is kind of tied in here too, this hedonistic, pleasure-seeking thing that we have as a species. So those are some of the forces that are prevalent. Now, there's another kind of, in some sense, those forces you could almost see as a reaction to previous eras of scarcity. Maybe it's not so one to one cause and effect, but you can see that there was a shadow to previous eras of scarcity that by comparison our era in some dimensions, I don't know if fully commit to this statement, but in some dimensions looks a little bit better, a little bit more enlightened, where you, if we're talking about a relationship, being locked into a really unhappy relationship because that was the cultural norm, because perhaps there wasn't a lot of choice, you didn't feel you had the autonomy to make those changes in your life, and so there is such a thing as being unequally yoked, to use kind of a religious expression, or to being obviously in a really unhealthy relationship. And so having the freedom to choose, having the freedom to get out of an unhealthy relationship is really important, you know. And especially it can move into really abusive territory, and obviously it's really important to not be in an abusive relationship. So that, and then in relatively less significant matters, there's something nice about being able to find that exact item, on Amazon or whatever that you're looking for, and having that choice that and not having to go all around town or 2 cities over to find a certain part that you need, or whatever. So there's pros and cons here. This is where discernment comes in, and you have to navigate all this. But because we've gone from this kind of era, I'm just calling it scarcity, that's probably not the best way to label it, but this era of more rigidity, solidity around commitments, and scarcity, let's say, 50 years back and prior, to this era of just, with tech boom, with modern transportation networks, with things like, the internet, dating sites, apps, in every dimension, it's kind of the same thing. If we're talking about jobs, you commit to a job for your entire life in the past. Now it's gigs. It's kind of the logical conclusion of that breakdown of loyalty and commitment in the dimension of employment. In the professional dimension, the gig economy is kind of the logical endpoint of a lot of that. And again, there's trade-offs, and it's not a unqualified good or totally bad, but certainly not unqualified good. But and so these last, let's say, 50 years, with, if it were on a chart, just it'd be like an exponential takeoff. The last, let's say, 10, 20 years of availability and choice in every area of our life. I think it's like pendulum swing is one analogy. It's like we're so far in this one direction, and we've swung so far into the non-committal, instant gratification, disposability direction. And I think, or the philosophical idea of thesis, which would be the previous era, antithesis, which is the current era, and synthesis. It's something like that, where I think potentially it's still so novel, something like the internet, something like Amazon, something like dating sites, something like Indeed or ZipRecruiter. I'm trying to touch different domains of our lives here. This technology is so new in the ways that it's interfacing with and interrupting and complicating our human lives, and the fallout and the consequences and the ripple effects and the downstream, impacts of all these things. It's still so relatively new at a large scale that there's in a sense, it's fertile ground for, because you could get really pessimistic and say we're just totally headed in the wrong direction. But there's an optimistic way to look at this, which is we're kind of exhausting. There's an opportunity here to exhaust the hedonic impulse individually inside of each of us and collectively, where we have such access to material possibility, to choice, that it's like we've condensed what would have taken potentially lifetimes of accumulated social knowledge or many years within any individual's life to come to the conclusion that infinite choice is not infinite bliss, because we've optimized that process. In a sense, there's a possibility that we've optimized the time it takes to become disillusioned with hedonism, disillusioned with infinite choice, disillusioned with, sensory gratification. What may have taken entire lifetimes for some people, now there's a possibility that within a shorter, it's hard for me to put an exact time frame on it, but a shorter amount of time, the wisdom of money doesn't buy happiness, or choice doesn't buy happiness, material wealth, instant gratification doesn't buy happiness. That wisdom has a chance to dawn, to arise in an individual life in a more condensed, distilled way. The time frame potentially is shorter because we get to a point of saturation, of overwhelm, of disillusionment, of pain, of collapse, of suffering, of exhaustion, breakdown. We potentially get there quicker than previous generations, if that makes sense. Now, you wish it didn't take that at all. Like, why do we have to run that futile experiment? But it just seems part of the deal here on planet Earth for some reason. And getting to the point of saturation or breakdown, disillusionment, that's not good. That doesn't feel good. That's a catastrophic failure of basically everything the culture has sold you and what you built your identity on. So that's awful. It's fucking awful. Another word for that is suffering. You reach a critical point of suffering, of pain. So that sucks. So that's not good. But what can happen post that, or in that recognition of that brokenness, you can come to recognize this is not working. This is not peace. This is not happiness. This is not fulfillment. And that's a death. And it doesn't happen for everybody. I mean, many, perhaps most, I think it's safe to say, are not blessed enough to become disillusioned. I mean, that's one way of framing it. And again, you don't want to say disillusionment is a blessing, really, because that can feel a little glib, and just like you don't want to too easily say suffering is grace or something like that. But anyways, you can come to recognize that in a human life, and that death, and then starting to recognize what else is out there, what else is possible. And that's about the time spirituality comes knocking, right? Some form of a depth practice, or God, really. I mean, that's the ultimate dimension that we're striving towards. The rest are surrogates. It's like that quote, is it Hafiz or Rumi, or I can't remember who, but God's language is silence. All else is a poor translation. It's like God's being is peace, is bliss, is wholeness. Everything else, your addictions, cigarettes, alcohol, gambling, porn, relationships, social media, internet addiction, those are all counterfeits. Those are all surrogates. Those are all poor translations, in a sense. They're counterfeits, they're surrogates for the true sustenance of life, for true life, which is God. Um, and so, yeah, you can come to recognize the futility of, the kind of disposable instant gratification hedonic treadmill that many of us find ourselves on. And the next step there is a good one, an interesting one, which is surrender. It's not really a step. It's falling off the cliff. It's surrendering. And what is surrender? It's surrender. It's stop. It's stopping. See, the hedonic treadmill implies motion, right? Forward movement, instant gratification, hopping from thing to thing to thing. That implies momentum, forward progress, movement. And in order to get into these deeper levels of healing, of connection, of intimacy, of healing splits, divisions, woundedness, it implies relative to that motion, it implies a stopping. And that momentum has to burn off. It's like Ramana Maharshi talking about, the recognition of self, capital S. That's one thing, but then there's all the momentum of you could say, habits, tendencies, addictive patterns inside of us. And it's like, he uses the analogy of, it's like when you turn off a fan, the power is cut, you've recognized this is not the way, this is not the truth, but the fan still some momentum has to burn off, before it comes to rest. It's something like that. But in order for things to come to rest, this is a very not so simple, simple in a sense, but not so easy. What I'm describing is not necessarily, it's straightforward, but in a way it's not. Because we have so much momentum behind our addictions and behind our habits and our pleasure seeking and grasping and instant gratification and stopping and surrendering to that is like you've got a tsunami at your back, and the moment you stop, the tsunami keeps going, right? And you have to let that move through you, and on the other side of it, the ocean evens out. But while that stuff's moving through you, and you're surrendering and you're not going along in front of the tsunami, it's not the best analogy, but while you're in that surrender, it's a lot of tumult as that stuff is coming up and you're releasing and you're de-stressing is one way to say it. You're burning off, you're alchemizing, you're healing, you're letting energies surface and move through you. You're crying, you're emoting, all the stuff I've talked about in this channel. But it's countercultural because, again, we've got so many forces arrayed against us in this direction. It's worthwhile, and it's the path to true healing and to true peace, and that's why it matters. And it really comes to matter when you reach a point of desperation, realizing all the strategies the world has given you are recipes for entropy, recipes for suffering, recipes for dissatisfaction. And so it's in a sense, it's almost out of desperation that you can come to realize some of this. But so the spiritual life is predicated on a stop, on a surrender. And that's really the whole life. That's the whole pattern. End of video, really. That's the whole path, is surrender. And if there is to be movement in any direction, I've said this before, it's a turning back within. Rather than moving out, projecting life outwards, it's a turning back within, to all the abandoned parts, all the undigested energies and wounds, and there's a stability there because it's the stability of unconditional love, unconditional strength, unconditional peace. It's God's being that more and more permeates and shines through. Now, how does this connect to the the beginning of this video? Let me try to center here. Let me take a second here. So what opens up is a kind of a depth dimension that when you're in the treadmill of life, kind of in the social default reality, uh, becoming more and more extreme, more and more disconnected with every advancing year and advance in technology, and it's like we become more and more superficial as a species in some ways, where relationships become disposable, where we have a harder and harder time committing because there's this notion that there's something better out there just around the corner, the next scroll, there's something novel and something new. And so it kind of traps us in this very surface level, superficial bandwidth of reality. Spiritual life is the possibility of opening up into a depth dimension. And so and that's a great insight, and it will enrich your life powerfully. But there's a shadow here that this whole video in a sense has been a setup to try to bracket, to try to get into, to more clearly pinpoint or highlight there's a shadow in that depth dimension that I want to get to. Where on the spiritual path we can get this kind of recognition that commitment to something, and I'm saying this as a spiritual thing, it overlaps with or connects with things that are just good character traits. This is good human development in a sense, learning to commit to something. Be it a job, be it a person, be it I'm gonna try to incorporate an example with a physical object, car. But in a sense, one dimension of this is just good human development, healthy human development, good character, that you have a sense of loyalty, that you have a stick-to-itiveness where you're able to push through some adversity and challenge, and that it can be healthy for your growth. And in the spiritual path, that dimension of your being develops in spades, because you're moving into the deepest, progressively deeper layers of pain and darkness, in some sense, shadow and confusion, undigested stuff within your own being, your body, at all levels, the less dense levels of your being, of creation, things that you haven't been able to process in the past. And in that sense, it's been like a barrier. It's like that's the level at which you become superficial, because it's like these depth dimensions of pain. The more you're able to open into those and to sit with those and to not run and to let these things come up and to heal them and to cry and to protect them, the more profundity, the more depths open up, the less superficial, just kind of in a technical sense there. The depths of creation start to open up. And that's the spiritual path. But and that's good. And that's good, and that's the direction that you move in. But there is a shadow there. And let me see if I've said enough where I can just kind of lay it out now. Where you commit to something beyond the point at which it is healthy. Something like that. So let's say in a relationship, you're no longer so quick to cut and run when something gets triggered inside of you, or to, you've got some capacity to express and to deal with conflict or to deal with stuff that comes up. And you've had breakthroughs in a relationship in that direction. And that's good. That feels good in a relationship. There's a safety there that can come online. And it's countercultural in our, as I've said, in our disposability moment in time and in our culture. But this is where that threshold image comes in, the range of healthy versus unhealthy relationship. And some relationships just are not forever. Some relationships just are not healthy. No amount of healing, no amount of inner work is going to make the difference. It just will always be kind of a net drag, a net negative. And so you have to hold all these different competing forces in mind, and you have to be willing to stay long enough to do your due diligence to really discern, is this my own stuff? Is this my own weakness? Is this my own predisposition to run? Is this, the kind of cultural, even there's a way in which our psychological approaches and kind of pop psychology, but even our therapeutic approaches can kind of feed this cycle of narcissism in one sense. It's kind of a harsh word for it, but where we can kind of get this therapeutic, probably be better to say pseudo-therapeutic or pop therapeutic notion of self-care, run amok, right? I'm thinking of that song Flowers. Who is that? Miley Cyrus, is that her name? Where she's singing, I can buy myself flowers, I can hold my own hand, I can love me better than you can. Is that the lyric? It's a good song, actually. I kind of like the song. But the moment that becomes anthemized, and there's a moment in a relationship where that can be a healthy thing, that kind of mindset. But there's also a way in which we can too quickly move there and too quickly cast what may be a healthy relationship with just some things to work through that would ultimately be conducive of growth. We can too easily throw that away with that self-care mentality, with that whatever's kind of being embodied in that song to some extent. Maybe I'm not being fair with that song, but and hopefully I've laid out enough shades of nuance here that you can see how this is a discernment process, and it's not so straightforward, where you really have to do some inner work, and it's good to have other people to talk to. Because I almost want to say that the bigger problem at a societal level, civilizational level for us, especially in the West, is the disposability problem. And so that's the one that probably needs the most airtime. But within a kind of really committed spiritual path, this other thing that I'm trying to point out can arise and is an important thing to be aware of, where you martyr yourself, you become overly locked in on something because you're so committed to this idea of difficulty leading to growth, difficulty being healthy, difficulty being constructive, and this idea of I just need to keep opening up myself, keep healing, keep releasing. These are things within myself. These are shadows within myself that I need to heal, and that's why there's so much conflict here. That's why there's no harmony here. And so this is a pretty narrow message I'm trying to convey, and most people, it wouldn't be for most people, I guess. I don't mean to sound holier than thou or something, but I've just noticed this, it can be an issue where you stay in a relationship long past the expiration date, long past the point where it would be healthy. I can't find quite the right phrase to sum it all up, but it's something like a messiah complex. It's something like a martyr complex. It doesn't have to be that pathological. Again, I think we can get into it for very noble reasons, very high-minded reasons, that we want to grow. We want to use the stuff of our life to embody, to be grist for the mill. And this is kind of the danger, one of the dangers, one of the friction or tension points, I can't think of quite the right expression, within religious communities, wherein, once you pass that threshold of productive, healthy growth, you quickly get into burnout and into cult territory. I'm thinking of Andrew Cohen, rest in peace, and his Enlightened Next, I think it was called, community, and how it started out with these high-minded ideals, but he had this way of just ratcheting up the pressure. If it's a rock tumbler, turning the spin cycle, turbocharging the spin cycle, and putting so much conflict, so much demand, so much pressure on the community that it hurt a lot of people, wounded a lot of people deeply, and burned people out. And so there's an underlying principle here on the macro and at every level here that I'm trying to detail. And, in a relationship, it can get to that point where it's too unhealthy and you need to move on or make some dramatic changes. But I think we're too quick too lazy in a sense. I don't know if that's quite the right word. But yeah, too undisciplined, too gratification oriented, where we move too quickly to that phase of saying, this isn't going to work. Let's just start over. Let's try something different. So that's one end of it. But the other end is staying into something because you're growth oriented, because you're doing the work and trying to heal. And God, maybe you have to be willing to leaving, changing, cutting ties, whatever, has to be a possibility. You have to have that as a possibility. Now, there's all kinds of steps in between when you're facing difficulty, seeking help. If it's a relationship, seeking counseling. There's many steps to take before you get to that point, and we don't do that culturally enough. But with a job, that's one way I can relate to it a lot, and I've done a video on this recently, but I feel I have done exactly what I'm inveighing against here, trying to express here, preaching against here, teaching. I don't want to say teaching, but expressing here, where because I felt almost like an obligation to stay in it, to keep pushing through these difficulties, to find a growth edge, to find that place within me that's hurt, rather than projecting it out as somebody else's problem. What's the move I can make here that's going to heal this, the maximal move I can make? And I did find that in many cases, that there were things that I wasn't being accountable about or stepping into. But I feel I way overdid it, way overshot it, with the current situation where I'm working. This is just one example. And that happens too. I've done it in relationships too. This is a shadow for me, looking back through my history, where I've stayed in the last really significant relationship. It's been a while, thank God in some ways, but a romantic relationship was in it way too long. That's a little bit different because I think I was just so wounded on so many levels that it wasn't exactly what I'm describing here. But definitely in this current situation, it's like it's this place that you can get to where your spiritual commitments can be unhealthy. And sometimes what God, not always, and probably not most of the time, so be very careful with a statement like this. Again, Let me stress that. But sometimes God is asking you to move on. That you've done enough here, done enough work here, you've gotten all the juice out of that you were meant to get out of this environment, and it's time to move on. And continuing to stay there is going to be deleterious to your health. I was thinking about it recently with the car that I had. Had this car for many years, more than a decade that I was with, and grateful for the car that I had. Got me through so many difficult times, so many hard times. I'm so grateful to have that car. But more and more in this past, let's say, year or two, it keeps breaking down. And even there, it wasn't like at the first breakdown, it was time to cut ties with it. Part of it was just because I didn't have money, so there was that parameter. But so I've stuck it out for the past couple of years, and there's been a lot of really good things that have come out of that. You know, I've saved thousands, I'm convinced thousands at this point, of dollars because of my commitment, because of the money parameter on the one hand, but because that I was willing to invest in. There's so much that you can do that an auto shop does not need to do for you. And I knock on wood saying that, or I don't know. I thank God that these breakdowns where the red triangle of death would come on and the car would completely die, or there's a couple of different instances I can point to. I did a video on this too, but I didn't freak out. You can feel very disconnected from technology and from cars, especially if you didn't grow up with a lot of like auto mechanic knowledge or practice. Or I'm not totally ignorant, but compared to some people, relatively speaking, quite ignorant. It was never something I super invested in. I've got a decent mind for understanding when I have looked into things. But even for me, there's this feeling like I need an expert here, especially with like more modern cars. This one wasn't super modern, 2007, but you can feel kind of like I don't have the diagnostic equipment, I don't have the tools, and often that is the case. But I found just through trial and error that many times, 8 times out of 10, 9 times out of 10, after I had gotten a tow somewhere, back to where I was living or wherever, and did some research, I was able to figure out what the issue was and able to work on it myself, and able to fix it. Amazing. And it's an empowering, very powerful thing. I recently got a car. That's been a whole nother fiasco. But on this old car, before I got rid of it, I had a breakdown, engine just died, triangle of death. And then it takes hours to get the AAA going, and you're like trying to find the right shop that's going to be available. Now I got to get a ride to work, which is more money out of my pocket. It's just this whole thing. It's a super stressful thing to not have reliable transportation. But the shop, I did bring it to a shop to get a diagnostic done on it. They charge $200 usually. It's highway robbery. It's highway robbery. It's insane just to diagnose before they've done any work. So I brought it to this place, had it towed to this place, and they were quoting me $500 or $600 in addition to the diagnostic, I think, or maybe that would have been counted towards that, I don't know. However, I had a suspicion of what it was because I'd gone through this before when my car died on a highway, on like a busy road. It was a very dangerous, scary thing that happened, but somehow by the grace of God, I got out of that situation. But I'd come to, it was this thing in the car, the mass airflow sensor, MAF, mass airflow sensor, which regulates the fuel-air mixture, if I'm understanding it correctly. Anyways, what could have been many hundreds of dollars to fix, after I'd looked into it, I figured out I could do myself. All it took was basic tools, socket wrench, Actually, I had to buy one or two specialty tools, but just, $10 purchase, $20 purchase, and a specific cleaning agent for the mass airflow sensor. Took me about 15 minutes to disassemble, get the part out, and somebody with more skills and more familiarity could have done it in less time than that. Cleaned it out, let it dry, put it in, fixed the fucking problem. Saved hundreds of dollars, and the sense of empowerment, like I had done something worthwhile. It was great. It was worthwhile. And, it's the kind of thing that our modern disposability moment, instant gratification moment, doesn't incline us towards. And that's just a stupid little example, but I can point to a number of things, especially specifically with this car. I had a rodent infestation in the car, which was a fucking nightmare. Hang on a second. Battery's getting low. I live kind of in a semi-rural area, and so these things happen, but I mean, it could happen anywhere really. Got into the boot of the car, where the spare tire is underneath the kind of storage compartment in the back, the trunk, back area. And there was this nest there. And by the time I realized what was going on, I mean, it's a longer story. I had a notion that something was up, but by the time I really clocked it and started to look, because the smell was becoming really overwhelming and there was little evidence of things going on, it was bad. It was really, really bad. Smell was awful. I had killed the, I guess, mother mouse. I laid out a mouse trap at one point. I didn't, this is the first go-round, first rodeo with something like this, so I didn't even think that there would be a nest or babies. And I think I probably looked under the hood, which is a kind of common area in the, what do you call that? Where the air filter is, the air box. I don't know what you call it. And I didn't see anything in there. And so, but eventually I took things apart and found this nest, and there were a bunch of dead babies. This is probably TMI, it was quite a disgusting story, or disgusting experience, quite a gross story, and it was bad. I mean, they had been there days, and I had to oh man. I remember calling somebody in a number of different places, auto mechanics, and when you're working full time and you're stressed out and this is your day off, when you're exhausted and you're trying to figure all this shit out and you're like, fuck, my car's totaled. It was just high anxiety, high stress. You don't have money for a new car. Anyways, it was just bad. So I was calling around to places and everybody was giving me doomsday, worst case scenario, your car's fucked, your car's totaled. They were also throwing in the fact that if I brought it in, they would have to have hazmat, full bio, what is that? Bio suits, biohazard suits, because of the potential of West Nile or hantavirus, with this area of the country and with these. And so I quickly tailspin and got into this really anxious place. I remember I called CDC, Center for Disease Control, was talking with them. That helped steady out the ship a little bit, because they were saying, just monitor for symptoms, but it's really unlikely. Once I started looking into it and the actual number of cases per population, or cases at all, of hantavirus and stuff, is just very, very low, especially the county where I live and all these things. So just statistically, it started to become clear that I didn't need to be in full-on panic mode, because that's got a high lethality rate, hantavirus, West Nile and stuff. Anyways, so these fucking idiot mechanics just threw me into a tailspin. The car's destroyed and it's totaled at this point, because you're going to have to take everything apart to get down to the floorboards, basically, to get down to under the carpeting, under the insulation, to be able to clean it out. And it's going to cost a ton of money. It's not worth it for the car sake. And I'm like, fuck, man. So I'm driving in this disgusting car and freaked out. But what I did is I just step by step disassembled the back area of the car, pulled up carpet where I could, found the areas that were most. It's like once you're in this hypothetical space where it's doomsday, everything is bad, but once you kind of focus in on the concrete details of the task at hand, there's a way in which that can alleviate some of the anxiety because you see, okay, this half of the car has not been affected at all. Thank God so far, I'm not noticing anything with the electric. Often they can get in and destroy the electric system, nibble on the insulation on the wires, and that can be a total nightmare. Thank God that hasn't happened. So let's just check that off, okay? Hantavirus, I'm freaking out that I'm 2 weeks away from being interred 6 feet underground. Okay, no, that actually, when we look into the details, hugely unlikely. And if it is to come to pass at this point in my life, I'm kind of like, I don't want to suffer on my way out, but there's going to be better things after this life. I'm not so rigidly attached to that part of it. So sorry, that's kind of going in a different direction here. But anyways, you look into the details, it's probably not, that's probably not going to happen. And so I isolated the part of the car that seemed to be affected. And I just got to work, disassembling and being as careful as I could as I went to remember, where certain parts, certain bolts, certain screws went, and, trying to be mindful as best as I could. Again, I'm tired. I'm on a day off in between work trying to figure all this shit out. And I don't have the best toolkit. I've got this kind of cheap toolkit, so there's some frustration with not having having the right tool makes a big difference. Big difference, especially working on cars or working on anything. It can save you so much heartache and time, but you make do with what you have, and it's gross. I mean, I was extracting out dead mouse baby after dead mouse baby, because after the mom died, obviously, these babies are there in the nest, and I guess they just died, starved to death or whatever. It's pretty gruesome. So it smells awful, and I'm worried that there's going to be, and they're tucked away in all kinds of weird different places, as I'm disassembling and finding these little pockets of things and hard to access places, and there's a dead one in there I'm taking out, and it was bad. And then I got my bleach out and cleaning supplies, and I'm just scrubbing the hell out of this car down to kind of not the frame, but the metal. I don't think that's the frame, right? It's not the chassis, it's the metal. I don't know. Underneath the insulation, underneath the carpet, underneath the storage areas, you get down to the metal the metal part of the car. Wish I had better vocabulary here, forgive me. The metal skeleton, the metal skin, the metal what? Okay, maybe body or shell is a closer way to, anyways, get down to the metal part, the metal shell, the metal body, and cleaning all that stuff out. And you know what? And I had air fresheners, and I was just trying all kinds of different things and doing the best I could. But you know what? I fixed the fucking problem. Not only did I not die from hantavirus, not only did I not have to take it in for a massively expensive hazmat biohazard inspection and strip down and detailing of the car, totaling of the car, thousands of dollars. I fucking cleaned it myself. It was a pain in the ass. It was disgusting. Disassembled it, stripped it down, cleaned it, put it all back together. Smell went away. I did a good enough job that the smell went away. So that was a nightmare, but I saved thousands and kept the car, was able to keep the car and eventually sell the car. Not for much, but, or trade in value, I guess. Anyways, this is a really long rant, and there's, a handful of other examples with this car, ways that it made sense to stick with it, and there was a benefit in sticking with it. I feel like I grew as a person. I grew my in a sense, I could say I acquired some mechanical knowledge, but it was more I acquired a confidence to approach those situations in the future, where I just was more at peace when it kept breaking down and more able to just rationally think, okay, well, potentially I can fix this. Let's see if I can fix this. And there are many things that you can fix, and even smaller, routine maintenance type of stuff, oil changes, etc. And so, but there again, at a certain point, when the car just keeps breaking down, and there is a stress there, even if you do have some confidence being able to fix it, there comes a point where the stress of having an unreliable vehicle, it makes sense that you try to move on. And potentially I pushed too far in that direction. That one feels like it kind of ran a more natural, healthy progression, and I got out of it just about on time. And I'm very grateful again to have had that car. But you can see how, that idea of it, you can be nickel and dimed to death, right, on a car. And so there's that sunken cost fallacy. It's like, at what point do you keep going, keep trying to limp it along, keep trying to heal, keep trying to work and grow? And at what is that point when it becomes problematic, becomes unhealthy, becomes, in the case of something like a car, the point when you need to move on? And so those are, three kind of domains that I'm just thinking of right now. With the car, with an employment, with a job, in a relationship with somebody. Because there is a courage and something skillful and something good about somebody who is able to and unafraid to or willing to try something new. That is something good and something commendable. So that's another shade of this. Being willing to change. But there's all these other, I've tried to lay out some of the other cautions here and these other forces to consider. But sometimes it can, for us that are very, spiritually oriented, that are highly disciplined, that are really locked in on stuff and committed to healing, committing to whatever it takes, committing to walking a difficult path. God isn't always asking for you to take the most difficult path. That's another part of this. Sometimes God wants to show you something easier, and that's hard for some of us to hear, to accept. But to give yourself that permission can sometimes feel like a great grace. I've been trying to give myself permission on a couple of different areas recently to move on, to feel okay with moving on, that it's not a surrender or defeat or running or something like that, that there's an intelligence there and it's healthy. It's the right move to make. It's the smart move to make. I did that video on this a long time ago where I brought up this teaching I got from Craig Holliday, very useful teaching, and I'm sure it didn't originate with him, but I think that's where I first heard it. Though I think I probably heard shades of it from Ram Dass or other teachers, but this idea of every form casts a shadow. That's really important with spiritual teaching, because when we're in the realm of spirituality, we're tending to fix our focus on the absolute, on a transcendent value, on the transcendent. But at the moment we descend out of that space of pure formlessness into even the most enlightened, most God infused, most balanced point teaching, pointers, pointing, that that moment that something crystallizes into something like a teaching or into words that we express, you've already there's a form there. Now again, it can be an enlightened form, it can be a relatively more balanced, it can cast less of a shadow, but there will always, just by necessity of being in form, every form casts a shadow. There's always, and the reason I mention that is because be careful with how you hear teachings, because there's an appropriateness, a timeliness to every teaching. And out of season, in the wrong time, hearing something and grasping a hold of it as the truth, ultimate truth, is dangerous, and and potentially will lead you astray, because a teaching always comes as a corrective to something that's out of alignment. And if it's helping you to come back into alignment, back into a centered place, that's when it's useful. But the moment you're there, hang up the phone. The moment you get the message, hang up the phone. The moment teaching has done its job, get rid of it. You don't need it. The whole point was to get you into a place of peace, into connection with God, to being centered, to being healed. And that's the raft. It's the raft that gets you across the river. Once you're on the other side, you don't need the raft, and hanging on to it ain't going to do you any good. But in a similar, slightly different way, if you're, let's say, crossing the river, and the teaching that's offered is a pair of skis, but the problem you're facing is a river, be discerning enough, wise enough, intelligent enough to recognize, okay, this teaching makes sense in a certain context, a certain time and place, at a certain juncture on the path, but right now this is not the right teaching for me. And it may be hurtful for me to follow that teaching. That's a potential. If it's a river and I'm given skis as the support, that's not going to help me get across the river. That's potentially going to lead to me drowning. It's kind of a stupid analogy, but so there's an appropriateness and a resonance that a teaching has, and if it's not resonant for you at that time, doesn't mean it's a false teaching or a bad teaching. It's not the right corrective for whatever. It's not the right medicine for whatever's ailing you, or it's not the right tool for whatever you're confronting. It's also not bad to have it in your, have it in your tool set, so to speak, for when it does come into relevance in your life, significance. So that's one way in which every form, every teaching being a form, can cast a shadow, is using it out of time, using it out of season. And I'm very guilty of that, where I will hear a teacher say something, and in a way where my OCD and paranoia can grab onto it and say, see, I told you need to do this really dangerous thing because the teacher's saying this, certain thing. Teacher's saying you have to go in you have to go all in no matter what, even if it's frightening, you have to jump off the cliff. I don't think any teacher says it quite like that, but you can get kind of fierce teachings like that sometimes, that in a certain mood, if you're in a certain place on the path, having that extra push to try something new can be really helpful. But for some of us who are willing to, unto the death, to follow the truth, willing to die for the truth, or willing to, that can be potentially a really bad thing to hear, because again, God isn't always asking you to do the scariest or most dangerous or hardest thing. So, anyways, that's just something to keep in mind, whatever the teaching is that you're engaging with. Feel if it's right for you, feel if it's right in that moment, and if not, don't be upset, don't fight it, just, on to the next thing, just let it go. All right, take care.